Well, hello everyone. So here we are, ninth quarter, technically third quarter of our trek through the New Testament. And I think this perhaps is going to be maybe our last effort at doing this. Talks with Richard, always see evolution to this process. But with the way the schedule is lined up with last quarter and now this quarter, it's just seems like it's, most conducive to do it this way. That being said, we are looking at having more live in session intensives later on in the future, hopefully with the next one being the 10th quarter, but we will see as we get closer to that. In the meantime, doing what was asked of me, and of course, very appreciative to always have the opportunity. I'm going to try to record these sessions for you, but break them down into each individual segment and try to do it one lesson at a time. So with that, you'll have several videos to flip through, and eventually you'll have the actual presentation, if you want a copy of it, emailed to you and maybe even printed it out. So as is always the case, we want to just touch on these particular things again, things that we will accomplish throughout this process is seeing how the understanding of the main themes of the gospel narratives and what those exactly are with respect to how we've studied the Old Testament, get a feel for how these themes established in the Torah, prophets, Psalms, the tripartite division of the Old Testament are influenced or influence the patterns used by the authors of the Gospels. And eventually beyond that, I think maybe toward the end of this quarter, we might be jumping into a little bit of the book of Acts. I can't quite remember. It's been a minute since I looked at the actual calendar. How the fundamental stories of the Torah and the prophets form the backdrop of the biblical narrative moving forward into the New Testament, because it's always important for us to be reaching back into the Old, draw those concepts out for our students. If we've been teaching it correctly all along, then hopefully we've been doing a fair measure of that to help them see in anticipation of where those things were going to be moving toward the Old in the New Testament, so that now as we're there, we can look back on those things we've already dropped the seeds of, and then hopefully help them appreciate that all the more. To recognize the need for bringing these concepts to bear as we teach the Bible to our students and ponder how this helps us and them to become better disciple makers. What we're always trying to do here is to help them understand the whole biblical meta-narrative as much as we possibly can in the limited amount of time that we have. And these connections are just so exponentially ample that we have so much lifetime's worth of information to work from. Now, I'm going to go through all of these themes over the course of our sessions together, and titling this section here, Messiah's Rejection and Triumphant Crucifixion, because ultimately that's exactly what it is. And so without further gilding the lily, we're going to look at the first lesson that we have this next upcoming Sunday from the vein of the theme of temple and the fact that in Matthew chapter 21, verses 1 through 11, it gives us Matthew's rendition of the triumphal entry of Jesus upon the beginning of his Passion Week. I'm loosely going to title this lesson, Jesus is the Eschatological Temple, which is not a title I haven't used already for a few other lessons that we've already discussed before in previous quarters. But that being said, I think it's perhaps a befitting title, but many others would work. But a few things I want to work through here, these four green boxes in the middle of the screen. First, revisiting Ezekiel. Now, we'll get to the text there at the fourth and final green box on the bottom, but work with me here, follow the breadcrumb trail in order for us to eventually get there, because we need to understand what's going on here, which is way more than just what's actually on the words in front of us, where Jesus is commissioned two disciples to go get a donkey. They're going to saddle the donkey for him with their own cloaks. And then, of course, there's going to be a great procession moving from the Mount of Olives up into Jerusalem with other people laying down their cloaks and palm fronds, welcoming Jesus with these exclamatory phrases, Hosanna, save us, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. And then, of course, others are virtually embracing him as Messiah and King. And Jesus finally, openly, publicly embraces this. There's all that, but there's so much more. And hopefully what I've tried to help encourage you to do in our time together in the past and through all of our Wednesday night sessions is to understand and appreciate that there are all these hyperlinks that are embedded by the author that we're focusing on this particular session or that moment on Wednesday night, that they are counting on us picking up on. If we don't see it, then one thing that is detrimental to us is that we're missing the full breadth of the scope of the passage, and with that, all the ramifications of what's being taught. So let me first encourage us to revisit Ezekiel. So the first blue box on the upper left portion of the screen, In Ezekiel's vision of chapter 10 of his scroll, Yahweh is seen leaving the temple in the form of his own glory departing it. Why? Because he's rejecting this temple by virtue of centuries worth of continued debauchery that's only exponentially amplified and gotten so much worse now in these final concluding days of Judah's kingdom, where the Babylonians are about to be sent by God to raze this temple to the ground. So in the orange box in the center of the screen, the people have to endure exile, which scripturally speaking, spiritually speaking, is seen in the vein of death. You know this to be the case because Ezekiel's on scroll in chapter 37, speaking about the restoration of people to the land. But it frames up that vision Ezekiel is seeing as a pile of dead human bones, mountains of them even, in this valley that will become the armies of Israel once they are resurrected and reconstituted with life, the life-giving spirit of Yahweh, filling them once more to then go back to the land where he says he is going to settle them in the land, right? So exile is death for them and a restoration from that, which in order to be restored from death, you have to be resurrected. And that, of course, comes at the hands of Yahweh. So now to the blue box on the upper right-hand corner of the screen. So after the temple is rebuilt, and this, of course, is still in Ezekiel's scroll, the glory of Yahweh returns to Zion to occupy the temple. We see this in chapter 43. But I have encouraged at many points, and will continue to do so, that from Ezekiel 43 through the end of that scroll, disagree with me if you may, we still have to understand that there are several ways of appreciating this fulfillment, but one of which has to be not only the fact that a physical temple will be built in Israel after Ezekiel's time, which is fulfilled, not waiting to be, is fulfilled in the days of Zerubbabel and Jeshua, the high priest, and of course, with that, you have Zechariah and Haggai. But as we move beyond that, that concept of temple, which is winked at with respect to the building of a new temple in the land as a promise of the fact a greater temple is going to come, that greater temple is what is symbolized in Ezekiel 47. As you read the very words of the prophet who says he sees this trickling little stream that he can practically put his foot in, and it stops the stream from flowing almost, one at least could envision that, to the fact that when it makes it down the mountain and it gets all the way to the Dead Sea without any tributary flowing into it to increase it in its depth and in its current, as goes the capacity of that current, it builds momentum and it builds speed. It builds depth until eventually it's flowing so fast and it's so deep that he can't continue to measure it by virtue of walking into it because it now goes over his head. And when it empties life-giving fresh water into the Dead Sea, it changes the salinity of the Dead Sea so that now actual marine life can flourish there. And on the lining the banks of the river on both sides happens to be trees that will produce fruit in all seasons. The leaves will never wither, and the leaves are used as healing for the nations. All of this symbology is rolled over into the New Testament to speak of Jesus being the source of this life-giving water, as he is the new temple that it's coming out of. John's gospel tells us he has rivers of water flowing from within him that others will drink and find their healing within. And of course, the concept of the trees themselves being both him and, as he says in John 15, us as the branches, and we are the conduits by which that healing that he provides are going out to the nations. All that to say, the New Testament is amply replete with the idea that he is the temple. We are the living stones built upon that temple. We, along with him, are that final temple. Now you may ask, well, what does this have to do with Matthew 21? Because the old temple is going to have to fall in order for the new temple to find any measure of significance. The old temple is going to fall with the new temple being built inside of it, because the gospel effort's going to start in the temple with what Jesus does here, what the disciples will do in Acts chapters 1 and 2, and then eventually launch out from there, while the temple is also one of the primary meeting grounds for the Jerusalem church. I meant to say the new church in Jerusalem, on throughout most of what's going on up until AD 70 when Rome comes and destroys it. But with that, the temple that Jesus has built and is built upon him continues to flourish even to this very day. So when Jesus comes in Ezekiel chapter 43, in the bringing of the glory of the Lord back to this new temple that's going to be built, that's the effort and the measure of what we're seeing here, is the significance of what he's doing here in Matthew 21. I got to move on. Next green box, revisiting Ezra. So over to the left side of the screen, In Ezra's history, the first wave of exiles who returned to the land, they of course rebuild the temple. But in a measure of speaking, the foundation is kind of rejected. Not really. I mean, it's not like people walk away from this project and say, we are disappointed, we're upset. But they clearly show that they are upset by virtue of those who are old enough to have remembered Solomon's temple and seeing what the dimensions of this new temple is going to look like in comparison are really woeful at the idea, because they know it's not going to compare to the former glory of Solomon's temple. However, after that, opposition to the temple begins. And of course, we see that those people who, through subterfuge, are trying to undermine the process and prevent it from being rebuilt, but they are unsuccessful. And Haggai and Zechariah are encouraging these people after years of dormancy and not actually being fervent in building this temple because of that opposition, to come out without these people's permission or even the king's permission to reignite the building project. And he promises that the glory of the latter temple will outweigh the former. Now, of course, what Ezekiel or Haggai is talking about here is not so much the grandeur of Herod's temple and taking what Zerubbabel and this generation of Jews has built and expanding upon it, but instead the concept that it will rival even Solomon's temple or any temple of its kind, because the temple that's going to replace it's going to be the temple that Jesus will build, and of course will be built upon him with him being its chief cornerstone, which would bring me now to the 118th Psalm. But before I do that, let me also connect, if you will, from the blue box on the right side of the screen here of opposition to the temple ensuing. That's exactly what we're seeing here in Matthew chapter 21, when these Pharisees and other religious and political elites are coming to him and saying, Rabbi, stop your people from saying these things about you. Do you not understand the ramifications of what they're saying and proclaiming you to be the son of David? And he looks to them and he tells them, haven't you ever read in the Psalms where it says the cornerstone that the builders rejected has indeed become the exalted one? This is something that the Lord has done. It's marvelous in our eyes. The reason why he's speaking to that very fact is that you are the ones who are rejecting. You are the ones who are opposing the building of this new temple. But as was the case in the Old Testament with the building of this temple that you are standing in the presence of right now, it wasn't conducive for them to do that. It did not result in their success. Hence, this temple would not be standing, but it is. Your efforts will not be successful because the Lord has exalted this new cornerstone for this new temple. So going to the 118th Psalm, blue block on the right side of the screen, the psalm begins with a blessing over the house of Aaron. Over and over again, we are told at the beginning of this psalm, give thanks to the Lord, he is good, his faithful love endures forever. Let Israel say, and then after that, let the house of Aaron say. And again, the idea is that they are to admonish the Lord for his faithful love that endures forever. But eventually, we will get to, in verses 13 and 14, they push me hard to make me fall, but the Lord helped me. The Lord is my strength, my song. He has become my salvation. These words come to us from the Song by the Sea that is invoked here in this psalm, not once, but twice. And of course, this is the moment when Israel's enemies, the Egyptians, are drowned in the Red Sea, and Moses is leading this great procession of Israelites to exclaim to the Lord that indeed he has become their rock, their salvation. Rock is not mentioned there, but it will be by those biblical authors who take up this phrase, become our salvation, later on, and attach it to that very phrase, that he has become our rock, our refuge from the subterfuge of the nations who would seek to overtake us, as pictured by the concept of roiling waves of Isaiah 17, that they're always threatening to consume us, but he is our rock. We climb up him. We seek solace and refuge at the top of his mountain where he resides to again provide us shelter. All that to say, the psalmist here is writing that to say that God has become his salvation. He's rescued him from the oppressiveness of his enemies, the exile that they would try to pull him into. He has provided new exodus, new life, new creation for the writer of this psalm. He'll go on to say the same thing in verse 19. Listen to this. Open the gates of righteousness for me, and I will enter through them and give thanks to the Lord. This is the Lord's gate. The righteous will enter through it. I'll give thanks to you because you have answered me. You have become my salvation, which leads us right into verse 22, which is what Jesus will say here. Third blue box, right side of the screen. The stone rejected is the temple wept over by the after the exile was concluded, but now exalted by the faithful. because it says here in verse 22, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This came from the Lord. It's wondrous in our sight. And this is the day the Lord has made. Let's rejoice and be glad in it. I'll take you back to that middle orange box. This song celebrates the temple of Ezra chapter 3. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean, they're reminding themselves of the faithfulness of the Lord, that he has brought them into the land as they dedicate the foundations in chapter 3 to then finish the walls to celebrate and dedicate it in chapter 6. Point being is that this movement of rejection is now completely consumed by the celebratory praise and the dedication of the temple as it's completed just 3 chapters later, albeit almost a whole generation later. And of course, this leads us to understand that Jesus is echoing these very words and saying that we lived through this once, but what was done by the hand of the Lord in allowing our people to overcome their enemies and all the opposition against them, this is exactly what's going to happen now, as you, those who want to stand in the way of it, are rejecting the cornerstone, but God has exalted it. There's nothing you can do to prevent this. And in the end, this is going to be the thing that ends their exile, right? Because that temple was built in Ezra's day after the exile was concluded, and the people are given the invitation openly by Cyrus to come back to the land. Now, the exile of Daniel chapter 9, with the vision of 70 weeks of 7 years, has finally come to its end. Messiah is going to be cut off in the middle of this the final week, and then eventually they're going to be led to the end of that time when he has done everything in order to bring an end to sacrifice and iniquity, and by virtue of that, welcome these people in to the new creation that's going to come after that. Last and final box here, the breadcrumb trail to Matthew 21. So to bring it all together for you, let's go to the last blue box on the right side of it, or left side of the screen. Jesus arrived to Jerusalem from the east. This is echoing Ezekiel, right? He's the celebrated one who will build the temple of Ezra chapter 1, because in Ezra 1, we see that's the proclamation of Cyrus for these people to go back to their homelands. They are given all this massive amount of treasure to go and do it. By virtue of that, Cyrus, per Isaiah chapter 41, is the servant that precedes the servant of 42, who is actually the one that is going to bring about the new and final temple. But Cyrus is the one who is his forebearer, the one who, by virtue of somewhat foreshadowing the efforts of this third and final servant of Isaiah's scroll, is going to be the one who first says, go and build the temple, the unexpected one who is rejected by the Jews of his day as being the one who will be the bearer of God's plan. But God, in the words of Isaiah from 40 through 48, is telling these people, no, I have done this, and you better get on board with it. Reject my plan, and you'll find yourself on the outside of it all. So those who are willing to go and trust are the exiles who follow Zerubbabel and Jeshua the high priest back to the land, and are there in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah when they come and continue on in the effort of building the temple. Point being, in the middle orange box, Jesus is the one that brings with him a new exodus from spiritual exile. We see it at Ezekiel 37. And that's the reason the people are saying, Hosanna, echoing Psalm 118. But that word means save us. That is Exodus language, right? He has become our salvation. Why are they screaming to the Son of David, save us? You could easily argue, of course, it's the idea that they want to be delivered from their Roman oppressors. Certainly all that's wrapped up into it. But the significance of what they're saying, just like Caiaphas, who predicted Jesus' death on the part of the nation in John's gospel, saying it unknowingly, unwittingly. These people may very well be saying, unknowingly and unwittingly, save us, bring about the final exodus. And he's going to do that. And the last blue box, he is the rejected cornerstone of Ezra 3, now lauded as the exalted temple of Psalm 118. All that's going on here in this particular moment where Jesus is coming in to the old temple as the new temple, as the people are lauding and praising him. So some things to think about as you go and deconstruct Matthew 21 and tear apart the Old Testament quotations and how they factor into all this. What's the thrust of Matthew's gospel? But I would highly encourage you to see it from this vein. And I think if you do, you might find some measure of significance beyond just what you find there in the black and white. All right, next lesson coming soon.